Okay, so this is the day when AIA reviews the aerospace industry's overall performance for the past year and gives its forecast for the upcoming year. Given the mixed weather outlook for our industry, this should be a particularly interesting report. This is Marion's 5th year of delivering the year-end forecast for the aerospace industry. As most of you know, Marion joined AIA in November of 2007 after completing a 5-year term as Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. At the FAA, Marion oversaw the safest period for air travel in U.S. history. Under her leadership, the next generation air transportation system was launched and significant progress made toward its implementation, which continues today under AIA's strong advocacy. Marion has a very distinguished background, having also served as chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board and administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, as well as in key positions at the Commerce, Education, and Transportation Departments, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the White House. Please welcome the President and CEO of AIA, Marion Blakey.
Thank you, John. And I want to say how delighted I am to be here today with a room of so many colleagues and friends who are contributing so much to this industry. And Doug, let me add my congratulations as well. Wowzers, as they say. That's quite a career. Wonderful. This year does mark the 47th year-end analysis we've presented here with the year-end review and forecast. I know a tremendous amount of hard work goes into this before I even get up here, and that's on the part of our Communications Council. So John, if you'll take thanks to all of those who've also helped from that standpoint, I'd greatly appreciate it. While catching up with old friends and colleagues is an important part of this event, we're also here to get a first look at the figures and facts that help us understand where we are going in some very turbulent times. Even in this tough economic environment, America must remain second to none, and our industry must remain second to none, because we're a leading job creator, a technological innovator, think GPS, think the internet, and a provider of that critical advantage in our nation's security, technology. We simply cannot allow that to be diminished by draconian cuts. That's why we have launched our Second to None campaign that's being supported by a lot of companies here in this room. We're all concerned about what is coming up in terms of the budget cuts. But to us, the real story is not the next negotiation or the next committee markup. The real stories that remind us every day of why our industry must remain best in the world are ones that are centered in the men and women we support. Look no further than Army Corporal Stephen Holohan. Following a heavy firefight in the mountains of Afghanistan, Corporal Holohan and his platoon found themselves in a very tough situation. They were being eyed by Taliban fighters who were planning to take out the entire squad. The enemy was more than a mile away, well out of small arms range, but the corporal's team was armed with a Javelin shoulder-fired missile. Holohan took aim, knocked out his targets with the longest shot that has ever been recorded with that weapon. He says the Javelin probably saved the entire platoon. And when he came home to Tampa, he did something that's rather unusual, I would conjecture, because he went over to the factory and thanked the men and women of Southern Manufacturing Technologies. That's the small company that made the parts for the Javelin's electronic cooling system. Corporal Holohan put it best. He said, "These little parts mean a lot." None of us could have said it any better. It's just one example of why our industry is second to none. But it's not enough for us to just share these kinds of stories among ourselves. Our leaders in Washington have got to hear these stories. They've got to know what we're all about and what we're delivering. And I do think it's important that with the Second to None campaign, we as an industry are speaking with one voice. We're talking about job creation. We're talking importantly about national security, and we're doing it through the media, across the internet, Capitol Hill, and American communities, more and more at the district and grassroots level, along with a very important warning, and that warning is that you're cutting to the bone of aerospace and defense budget if we move ahead with sequestration. Defense is not the answer to the country's budget woes. But this isn't just another Washington-based TV ad campaign. Behind this effort are real facts, real numbers, most importantly, real people. So, as we review the 2011 year-end report, and we look ahead to 2012, it's important to realize that the decisions that are made here in Washington have an enormous impact, not only on our national security, but on the bottom line, and ultimately on the livelihoods of thousands of families across this country. So with that in mind, let's look at the numbers, the tail of the tape, as they say. Based on preliminary data, 2011 has been a very good year. Despite significant headwinds and a cloud of recession over us, the U.S. aerospace industry performed well this year and remained one of the most significant contributors to the national economy. Annual sales are expected to top $218 billion, marking the 8th consecutive year of growth. And our annual sales are expected at this point to be up across the board in 2011. After a disappointing 2010, U.S. civil aviation sales are expected to total $49.7 billion in 2011, which is a 3.2% increase on an annual basis. Industry drivers, there are several factors there. Growth in Asia, certainly, and the strong demand for fuel-efficient aircraft. U.S. military sales are also expected to increase by nearly 6.7% this year, with sales estimated at $66.5 billion. For example, over the past fiscal year, the Defense Department purchased more FA-18 Hornets, and V-22s, both for the Navy and for the Marine Corps. Future sales also look very promising, as exemplified by a $35 billion contract awarded to Boeing for 179 refueling tankers this last February. Missile sales posted a slight gain, from $25.1 to $25.6 billion, although for the future, we think that munitions demand may be a bit vulnerable, as weapon stockpiles are often some of the first to get cut in a difficult situation. So we'll see how this trend goes in terms of the defense budgets. For the next year, this year, of course, was a challenging one in the space industry. The space shuttle retired, everyone knows, and we experienced cuts to NOAA's weather satellites as well as to the national space security programs. Nonetheless, sales increased from $45.3 billion in 2010 to a projected $46.4 billion in 2011. Aircraft and parts orders. Let's take a look at this. They jumped to an estimated $204.8 billion, an increase of $8 billion over 2010. Backlog rose by $20 billion over last year to nearly $463 billion. These numbers indicate an ongoing rebound more since the downturn that we saw back in 2009. Specific area, new civil helicopter deliveries. They've also improved in 2011. This is, of course, the market that includes medical airlift, offshore oil, gas exploration, law enforcement applications. And here we're seeing, following 2 years of sizable decreases, the U.S. civilian helicopter shipments are expected to increase to 454 aircraft in 2011, an annual increase of 5.3%. Now, let's go on to one of my favorite areas, and that's trade. By the end of the year, U.S. aerospace exports are expected to reach nearly $90 billion in 2011. That's up 12% after falling during the 2 previous years. The increase is due primarily to strengthening civil exports, which are expected to improve 14% in 2011. That will be reaching nearly $77 billion. The industry's positive trade balance of $57.4 billion is the largest trade surplus of any manufacturing sector. On the jobs front, aerospace employment is likely to register a slight increase in 2011. Total year-end employment was up slightly, reaching 624,000 jobs. So, despite this economy, we're holding steady as she goes. But, gotta be cautionary here, because a study that AIA commissioned recently concluded that if the $1 trillion is cut from the defense budget beginning in 2013, as sequestration calls for, the jobs impact will be devastating. 350,000 aerospace and defense jobs will be gone. That's out of 1 million jobs directly in our industry. When these jobs go, the impact in the supply chain and in local communities will be just over 1 million jobs lost. That's the loss of real jobs that are here today. And in this economy, it's really almost unthinkable to believe that we would allow that to happen. Jobs aren't our only concern when it comes to the threat of cuts. For example, purchases of military aircraft are expected to decline in the coming year due to the federal deficit reduction measures. Anything you can do to help this microphone. This is the second year in a row that this mic has been a challenge, so. The measures that are being contemplated at this point are when the military aircraft fleet is nearing its maximum service life limits. It's funny, when you talk to ground crews have pointed out to us that fathers and now their sons are flying in the exact same equipment. The recent grounding of several combat wings due to equipment stress is impacting the United States combat readiness. The current U.S. fleet, in fact, is the oldest in Air Force history. Many transport aircraft and aerial refueling tankers are more than 40 years old. This is just one of the alarm bells that we're seeing in the timing of potential budget cuts and in their impact on the defense and aerospace industry. Now, as I look around this room, judging from the looks on some of your faces as I roll through the 2011 stats, a lot of you look pleasantly surprised at actually how strongly we're finishing this year. I agree. Given the numbers we're projecting for 2011, you might make the assumption that we'd be rolling right on into 2012, and it would take years to reverse the kind of growth trends that we're seeing. Unfortunately, not so. We're projecting that 2012 will be a much different year. Looking ahead to next year, we expect aerospace sales to decrease by about $500 million. We expect declines in nearly every product group except civil aviation. Space sales are projected to decrease by about $1 billion, and military aircraft sales are projected to drop by $1.5 billion. As I said, there is certainly a bright spot in terms of civil aircraft sales, which we expect will increase from $49.7 billion to $51.7 billion, driven in large part by commercial air traffic and higher fuel prices that continue to have people seeking more fuel-efficient aircraft. Both are really spurring the world's airlines to replace their older fleet, and we're seeing that these trends are also spurred by the rapid growth in some of the Asian markets and in the Middle East. So the demand there is going to also continue to call out the need to get the next gen done, the next generation air transportation system. As you all know, these numbers tell only part of the story. Our industry is not only dealing with the downward pressures of this economy and the results of that, But we're also dealing with the tremendous uncertainty that's been created by the current budget process in Washington. In fact, our budget process calls to mind the infamous toast that World War II glider pilots used to use about the lack of success they often had with their endeavors. We'll have a budget that is, as they said, conceived in error, having suffered through a long and painful gestation period, and finally delivering at the wrong place and the wrong time. We've watched and waited last month while the supercommittee tried to reach consensus on cutting trillions of dollars from the national debt. November 23rd, committee failed to reach an agreement triggering sequestration and the likelihood of another $600 billion in defense cuts. So, sequestration is coming. Or is it? At this point, the picture isn't any clearer than it was before. Big questions loom about entitlements, taxes, and how they should be considered in terms of, are they part of the problem, are they part of the solution? Unfortunately, our industry faces exposure all around. Domestic discretionary programs could be cut by about 7% under sequestration, including deeper cuts to NASA, NOAA, FAA's programs, space programs. Once again, critical programs that, like NextGen, could very well be endangered. Meanwhile, uncertainty will reign. Military theorist Carl von Clausewitz said that although our intellect longs for clarity and certainty, our nature often finds uncertainty fascinating. Well, this Congress certainly finds it fascinating. We find it fascinating, morbidly so. We need a resolution. Until then, our industry will campaign to ensure that everyone knows where we stand, knows what's at stake. With our second-to-none campaign, lawmakers, the press, the American people, I think they're taking notice. In November, we held a huge rally up at BAE's Combat Systems plant in York, Pennsylvania. And it was here that I heard the story of Steve Smith. At the age of 19, Steve began work at BAE right out of high school. Today, more than 34 years later, he's working for BAE right at the same site. And his career, it's taken him from the plant floor to being a significant manager. Every day, a long, congested stretch of Interstate 83 stands between Steve's Harrisburg home and his job at BAE. But he said that long commute is a small price to pay for the work the company does to support America's military. It's worth it, he said. Couldn't ask for a better customer than America's men and women in the armed forces. Steve's just one of 1,300 workers at BAE whose jobs are at stake in the current battle over defense cuts in Washington. For Steve and others like him across the country, the only option for us is to keep fighting. It means new rallies, taking things to the grassroots, more outreach, and putting out more analysis, more hard facts, so that in our ongoing efforts to educate policymakers and stakeholders across the board, across the country, they do know what's at stake. They do know about the disastrous consequences of gutting the U.S. defense and aerospace industry. Thanks very much.